Why do I purposely decide to create art that is less aesthetically pleasing than it otherwise could be? This is a question that I think some people probably have when looking at my work and wondering why I do low poly 3D. And this is a question that I ask myself sometimes. Why do I do low poly 3D? Why do I not try and do anything a bit more detailed or obfuscate the low polyness of my work? For anybody who is unaware of how 3D works, there is a thing called a subdivision surface, and it is a modifier you add to a 3D model, and it will quadruple the geometry in a model and then smooth out the resulting quadrupled geometry. It's a very easy one-click way of taking a low poly model and making it a higher poly model with literally zero work. For certain models, you might have to go back in and tweak a little bit of stuff because sometimes the resulting smoothness changes the silhouette. But for the most part, you can take a low poly model like my work and double its detail in one click. And I purposely choose not to do this. And there are a few reasons as to why. So I wanted to kind of explain in this short podcast why I've decided to settle into low poly 3D modeling and not try and pursue something else. Because the obvious answer right off the bat would be I don't know how to do it. And that's true. I don't know how to do high detail modeling yet because I'm still pretty new to 3D and I'm kind of falling behind in terms of like time versus technique, simply because I'm doing multiple things. I'm not just spending 2 years doing nonstop 3D studying in a professional college environment or anything like that. I'm doing it in my spare time along with other things. So the obvious answer is that I don't know how to do it, and low poly is quote unquote easier, which is even debatable. It kind of depends on your mindset, and I guess that's could be another podcast, or I might go into it here. I don't know. These aren't scripted. They're just me going off. The obvious answer is that I don't know how to do it, but I could have learned sculpting, right? Like I could have started my 3D journey. I'm going to learn 3D sculpting, which is a way of doing high poly, high detail models. And I could have gone down that path, but I specifically, when I started doing 3D, made the conscious decision to do low poly. I wanted to do low poly artwork, like the PlayStation 2. And that's probably the first reason why, right? It's nostalgia. It's nostalgia for an aesthetic. I grew up in the heyday of low poly models. The PlayStation 1, the Sega Dreamcast, the PS2, the GameCube, the Xbox. They all had a very similar aesthetic where we kind of were in this time where games were slowly becoming more realistic. And I've mentioned this, I think, in other podcasts, where the PlayStation 2 was really the first console where visual fidelity came to a point that we were no longer approximating shape, but it was detailed enough that it was much more of a tangible representation. And I think this is a big reason why the PlayStation 2 era, the early 2000s when gaming really broke into the mainstream, is that it was no longer so abstract that normies couldn't get into it, right? You look at like Madden 97 or whatever the fuck it was called. The polygons are so obvious that you really have to use your imagination to kind of like be immersed in the world of this football simulation, right? And so some people liked it, obviously, but I think like the masses would look at that and think it looked goofy or silly, and gaming was relegated to a nerdy hobby. But once we got to the PlayStation 2 and we got to a point where like it's still low poly, it's still not going to be confused for real life, but it's at the point now where it's less of an abstraction and more of an approximation of reality. It made it much more digestible for the average person. And as someone who lived through that, and that was my childhood, watching games become less abstract, the PlayStation 2 was like the sweet spot where it was no longer so abstract that creativity had to be filtered down. When you played something on a PS1, your art style couldn't be one-to-one translated into the game. There were sacrifices that had to be made, and there were very creative workarounds to making aesthetics work on these consoles. Not to deride or undermine the work that was done on the PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64. There was a lot of really incredible work done. Of course, like Final Fantasy IX, gorgeous. Vagrant Story, gorgeous. Like, there's no arguing that. But with the PlayStation 2, it became much easier to translate the concept art and what the concept for the game was into the actual hardware and make it as close to a one-to-one representation as possible. And that really fascinated me as someone growing up before that, not being able to have that easy translation, right? Because you looked at Banjo-Kazooie. That was one of my favorite games in elementary school. And I would like flip through the strategy guide and look at all the pictures and the concept art of the game. And the concept art looked different than the game. The game was like a downscaled, abstract version. I'm kind of circling around the same point multiple times. Once you got to the PlayStation 2, like there was still a difference, but it was far smaller. The gap was much narrower. And so it was less about like imagining and projecting what you thought the game was supposed to look like and like actually seeing it. And I think that's why the graphical leap in that generation of consoles was so impactful. And it felt the most substantive to me in terms of just going from one thing to the next. PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 2 was a monumental leap. All that being said though, looking back on it now, and even just at the time, it never obfuscated too much the underlying reality that this was geometry, that this was polygons. It was very impressive, but at the same time, the cracks were there in the illusion. You know, you play Jak and Daxter, and it's like a cartoon, and it's animated, and it's smooth, and it's like really aesthetically pleasing. But you look at Jak's model, and like, there's still visible polygons. Like, you know, there's still visible edge rings and stuff. Like, it's all still there. And I guess now, in the modern video game aesthetic where everything is trying to be as realistic and filmic as possible, there's a part of me that's really nostalgic for that kind of really interesting middle ground where technology was just starting to get to that point, and we were in this transition period where like it's good enough that you can understand the aesthetic, but you can also see the technology there. In the PlayStation 1 era, we were abstracting the artistic vision. The technology was very obvious, and the art style was in the background. Now, the art style is in the foreground, and we're obfuscating the technology. You look at a modern video game, and bugs become so much more jarring because the game, when running properly, doesn't feel like technology as much as it does artistry, because the technology has gotten so good that you can do essentially anything within reason at this point. Your vision is very one-to-one translated, and the technology kind of fades into the background. But the PS2 had both. It had both. It was a very obvious display of technology and technological limitations, but also was complex enough to have artistry show through. And so just from a nostalgic point, and just from an appreciative point, that's something that really fascinates me, of having both of those cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. And just when I sit down and play a PlayStation 2 or an Xbox game, an original Xbox game, that melding of two sides of that equation when it comes to making 3D artwork, the technology side and the artistry side, just fascinates me. Because I can look at it on a surface level and understand the aesthetic, but if I stop and pixel peep, the mask falls off and you can see all the things they're doing. You know, a lot of the times when I'm playing a game on the PS2, I'll like just stop and be like, so how did they do the foliage? How did they do the grass? Is it a billboard texture? Is it a cross texture? Did they actually model some geometry for the grass? And like now, you can do the same thing, but it's so much more obfuscated. I don't know. And that's just something that really appeals to me, that nostalgia of recapturing that idea and being able to like go back in and very easily reverse engineer a lot of my favorite games and how they were doing things, because the illusion wasn't so complete that you can just look at a game and with a little bit of understanding of how the technology works, start to reverse engineer things. I was playing Tomb Raider Legends on the Xbox, and the reason I bring up grass is because this was one of the first exercises I did. I looked at like kind of some of the foliage in Tomb Raider Legend, and I was like, oh, I understand how they did that. Another game was Black for PS2. Again, did foliage and grass in a different way than Tomb Raider Legend. Tomb Raider Legend was a bit more abstracted, so it used some like bigger cartoony foliage that was fully modeled, whereas Black was trying to be more photorealistic, which aged very badly, but they were using cross textures that allowed for more grass at a lower detail that kind of from a distance, seem to read more like photorealistic grass as opposed to a very stylized, intentional choice. You can do that in these games, right? There were decisions that had to be made to work around the limitations, but it was never so limited that the art style started to become compromised. And that's something I really like about low poly. That's probably the main thing. It's just that there's nostalgia, and that nostalgia has spawned legitimate, actual appreciation. So, like, despite the fact that I could just subdivide my models and continue to obfuscate that technical side and make it look more artistic and less technical, I like that give and take of having both there. And I will continue to do so until my taste changes. Another thing that's really good about 3D, or low poly 3D I should say, is that it's much more manageable in a small team, because the assets are easier to create when you're working with lower geometry. There's no retopologizing step, textures can be simpler, UV unwrapping is simpler, just the hardware you need to create and run and use these assets is simpler. So if I want to just bring a laptop to a coffee shop, Lamau, remember going to a coffee shop? How quaint. So 2019, lol. But if I wanted to do that, or if even I'm just in the house and I just want to sit on the couch and work as opposed to being at my desk, bring my laptop up, it'll work. You know, even if I just have like a shitty little Ultrabook with integrated graphics, I can work on any of my models because they're so simple, they run on a potato. And that's also good for the end user, because once I get around to making 3D games, I won't have to worry about system requirements. You know, everybody will be able to run the game as long as I do decent optimization, because it's so simple. That's really nice too, is that just the fact that the assets are simpler to work with and simpler to distribute. Really fucking nice. And there was a third thing I wanted to bring up. Actually, no, because I kind of tied both of those together in the first point. So I guess that's it. That's why I do low poly 3D. I think it looks really cool. I think it's really interesting how you can have both the technical and artistic side co-mingling together at that detail level that I tend to work at. And it's not perfect. I'm sure some of my models are too low detail, some of them are too high detail to fall into the sweet spot that I'm actually talking about. But you know, it's close enough. It's fine. It makes me happy. I like the aesthetic. It's pretty cool. And that's why I fucking do it. So, there you go. I don't know if I've renamed the show the Hyperbolic Whine Chamber yet instead of I Am Podcast, but I made a mention of it on Twitter that you search for I Am Podcasts on Spotify or Anchor or Google or Apple, and it doesn't show up because it's too generic, I guess. I Am Games worked fine on YouTube. You could search I Am Games and the channel came right up, but I guess the algorithms on all these other platforms aren't nearly as good, so I'm gonna have to change the podcast name, and I'm leaning towards Hyperbolic Whine Chamber, because that was a solo podcast I did on the PCP back in like 2016. You can listen to some episodes on there if you've never heard them before. Tentatively changing the podcast title. I don't know if it'll even work. Will these platforms allow me to change the podcast name? I didn't think this through very well. Uh-oh, this is what happens when you just make a show on a whim with no planning, like I do. Goodbye. Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of the Hyperbolic Whine Chamber. In addition to doing podcasts, I also make a bunch of 3D models and animations, which you can check out at twitter.com/TommyOliverSays. I'm also making a video game called Izumi and the Vertical Slice, and I have a simple game out right now called Ninja Suffering. You can check those out linked on said Twitter profile. If you want to help support the show and keep me making it and keeping it ad-free, you can check out patreon.com/polystation2 or subscribestar.com/TomOliver. Patrons have access to over 70 bonus podcasts, so if you like this podcast and want more right now, that's the place to do it. Thanks again for listening. This podcast updates 3 days a week, ideally, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, so feel free to subscribe on your preferred platform so you can catch new episodes as they come out. And patrons get episodes a week early. That's all I got for now. Have a good one.